Thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to start by thanking all members of this committee for allowing me to speak now. In the normal course of things, without the programming motion, my amendments would come up in order, and my first amendment occurs at Clause 52. I have 8 amendments. They speak specifically and only to Division 8 of C-30 that relates to pesticides. Mais je vais commencer au début.
So I'll start at the beginning, and I want to thank my colleague from Mirabel for the Bloc Québécois, and another Bloc member as well, who had raised some of the same concerns in the House. The members for Rimouski, La Matapédia.
Our help, and also as we sit around this table, to Jazz, to everybody, obviously to Ryan, to you, Madam Chair, for the opportunity for me to, outside the normal programming motion, have time to speak to my concerns. Given that this bill, C-30, is this implementation bill for the Spring Economic Statement, the only line in the Spring Economic Statement that relates to Division 8 are these simple lines on page 96, announces the government's intention to amend the Canadian Food Inspection Agency Act and the Pest Control Products Act to include consideration of food security and cost of food. And I would submit, Madam Chair, if we'd had enough time in the House at the very beginning of this bill, should have moved to have this entire Division 8 removed as far beyond the scope of what was set out that we are now implementing. I recognize that most of C-30 does implement specific financial measures like excess tax and CPP and so on that are directly implementing what was in the Spring Economic Statement. But I submit to you and to all members of this committee because, as you may notice very quickly, this is a last-minute Hail Mary pass begging my colleagues to accept my amendments so that this wrong is not done. But the inclusion of something as significant and regressive as Division 8 in the course of an omnibus budget bill is something that I think the government will live to regret if they insist on continuing down this course of a massive change in pesticide regulation and placing economic considerations above human health and environmental risks. Because there were no independent witnesses before committee, because it moved very quickly, I'm not blaming anyone in finance, but the Finance Committee, but this is, I'm speaking now on behalf of l'Association pour la santé publique du Québec, Victimes des Pesticides du Québec, Breast Cancer Action Quebec, the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, the Canadian Biotechnology Action Network, the Canadian Environmental Law Association, the Canadian Partnership for Children's Health and the Environment, Canadians Children's Health Defence Canada, Council of Canadians Edmonton Chapter, the David Suzuki Foundation, Earth Education League, Eco Justice, Environmental Defense, Equiterre, Evidence for Democracy, Fondation Rivière, Les Amis de la Terre Canada, National Farmers Union, Nature Canada, Pesticide Free, Edmonton, Prevent Cancer Now, Quebec Environmental Law Centre, Safe Food Matters, the Saskatchewan Network for Alternatives to Pesticides, Vigilance OGM, and West Coast Environmental Law. Who am I to say I can speak for these people? I do because they submitted briefs, but their words were not heard before the Finance Committee because I submit again review of C-30 and Division 8, both in the chamber itself, where we had this bill tabled on April 29th, and after 3 hours of debate, the time allocation motion came down May 25th. So I don't think anyone could say, feeling confident in their own personal integrity, that this section, Division 8, had anything like adequate time before the House itself and before it went on division to second reading to this table. I'm so grateful for this chance. I've written some of you to say that my background, and it's strange that I know I'm only 72 years old, but for 51 years I've worked on pesticide issues. I was briefly the chair of the Canadian, not a couple of years, but when you're 72, it was brief. I was the chair of the environmental law subsection for the Canadian Bar Association, and I handled personally a number of pesticide cases in my career before politics. Briefly, to the committee then, why this is a substantial change and why it should be resisted, and then I'll describe my amendments as briefly as I can. In 1969, the Pest Control Products Act was passed in this country. It gave the regulation of pesticides being a category that includes insecticides, fungicides, rodenticides, and herbicides, to Agriculture Canada, pretty much exclusively, but with the Pest Management Regulatory Agency having to accept advice and sometimes vetoes from the Health Department. I won't go through step by step the different changes that occurred. The most significant change that occurred was when then Liberal leader Jean Chrétien put in the Liberal platform in 1993 that the Pest Control Products Act would be moved from Agriculture Canada over to Health Canada. That was done in 1995 with a lot of credit to someone who visited the chamber recently, former member of parliament, former l'ancien ministre de l'Environnement du Québec.
The former Environment Minister of Quebec, Clifford Lincoln.
Pour moi, un vrai héros. But Clifford Lincoln, who made the change that was in the Liberal Red Book to say that the Pest Management Regulatory Agency reports to the Minister of Health and that human health would take a more prominent role in the review of pesticides. Another significant event, which I mentioned only because I think Division 8 of Bill C-30 will run into trouble in court because in 2001, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled in the Hudson, Quebec case that the precautionary principle under which the little municipality of Hudson banned the use of cosmetic pesticides on lawns, and that was upheld by the Supreme Court of Canada because the Supreme Court said that the precautionary principle was now fundamental to federal pesticide regulation and Canadian law in general. The precautionary principle can be summed up as look both ways before you cross a street. Again, briefly, I'll just say that we often hear from whoever's in charge of pesticides at the time, regardless of party, because they all have the same talking point that says Canada has the most rigorous pest management regime in the world. That's just nonsense. To this day, Richard Nixon's FIFRA, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, is stronger and better constructed than Canadian pesticide regulation. So case in point, if I can find any reason that this has come forward in the guise of something to do with food costs and food security, it's the episode that occurred last year when the Pest Management Regulatory Agency, for the period of 1 month only, said it would not be okay to use liquid strychnine on farm fields in Alberta and Saskatchewan to deal with ground squirrels, also known as gophers. It was 1 month. The industry appealed. PMRA granted them the appeal with careful conditions because, as you can imagine, liquid strychnine is rather dangerous to be used in any uncontrolled environment. In any case, it seems that that may have given impetus to this quite wrong-headed idea that the federal cabinet should, as is described here in our Division 8 of Bill C-30, allow the federal cabinet to overturn a decision by a minister. So this is, again, in C-30. This is Section 28, sub 1, that the minister does not consider the environmental risk of acceptable. The governor and council may, by order, amend the registration if the governor and council considers it necessary to do so to protect national economic security, regional economic security, or national food security. Again, there are many things wrong with this, including that the timelines provided would allow extensions that would mean that something like liquid strychnine in an emergency consideration could be used for up to 9 years before being reviewed. Whoever drafted this section of C-30 wasn't considering the implications for human health or the environment or even the economy at all. So some of the evidence we would have heard had we had witnesses here is that the excessive, in terms of the European Union, Canadians need to diversify markets. Our farmers don't need their products to be rejected because of excessive pesticide use. But lentils from Canada have been rejected from a number of EU countries because we allow more glyphosate, trade name Roundup, than the EU will allow. So we've had crops rejected at the border. We don't need this. We need to work in harmony with allies, particularly within the European Union, to make sure that Canadian food exports don't face rejection at the borders. In any case, the groups I've mentioned have told me that as much as my amendments may improve things, they actually think it would be far preferable to, even to my amendments, would be, if all of them were accepted, they still think it would be the preferable course to delete Division 8 altogether. Nevertheless, with the assistance, I do want to thank the environmental law group Eco-Justice for their assistance, and my team, and I particularly thank Steve Parkinson, who is a very hard worker. He worked till 2 in the morning to make sure we could get these in by the deadline created by the motion that allows me to be here at all, and I know the clock is ticking. But the amendments, my first amendment speaks to the fact that C-30 doesn't define in saying that the cabinet can overturn a minister. It uses terms like national economic security, national food security, but without defining them and without providing any requirement for evidence or research or any kind of independent panel to review what the cabinet is doing, which appears to be a permission to overturn a decision that is reasoned and based on evidence with one that is purely political discretion. So my first amendment, amending line 4 at clause, and I won't go through these in great detail because I know time is ticking, and I'm so grateful for all this time to the Bloc and the Conservatives. If anyone's watching this, I would not be able to do this without the Conservative Party members here, each and every one of them, and the Bloc member here at the table, and all the Liberals here at the table. Thank you. I can't thank you enough for at least allowing me to present these, and I really hope you'll find it in your hearts to carry at least some of them. I should mention that my colleague and friend Stephen Guilbeault, I know he has a number of amendments here that speak to the issue of transparency. Those amendments, if accepted, will not deal with the problem created, the real offense to the precautionary principle, the notion that this government cares more about human health and the environment than it does about brief economic pressures from lobbyists. But my First Amendment attempts to define national economic security to include long-term sustainability and not to create unacceptable risks to human health and the environment. So I won't go through each definition, but the First Amendment is to create definitions around terms that are used to justify overturning a decision to say a pesticide is too dangerous to be used by the agency in charge. The Second Amendment adds again that the cabinet can only overturn a decision of a minister if the minister agrees that the risks to human health and or from the use of that product are non-negotiable. You can't change the decision if the minister has decided that really the human health risks are unacceptable. Again, my Third Amendment speaks to, again, if the minister, the cabinet must not make an order to overturn a decision if the minister responsible has determined that the health risks or the combined health and environmental risks are not acceptable. A second consideration, that the pest control product does not have sufficient value for the control of the infestation. And another thing that must be considered in decisions like this that isn't mentioned in C-30 is, are reasonable alternatives available? Is there another way to handle this emergency that requires, for instance, again, back to the prairie gophers, is there another reasonable alternative available? Rather ironically, the reason that the prairie gophers have become so much more prevalent and destructive is what are described in all the government documents as abnormally dry conditions. In other words, climate crisis and persistent drought. On my Fourth Amendment is that specifically emergency orders must not have extensions. It would limit the emergency order to 1 year and no extensions, because currently, as I mentioned briefly earlier, the 3-year duration in the bill is extendable by another 3 years and then followed by a phase-out period, so that the prolonged use of a product that has been determined by the minister responsible as unacceptable by cabinet override could allow the products to be continued to be used for up to 9 years. The fifth amendment I have, again, speaks to questions of not, this one I've removed, so pardon me for returning to it because we replaced it with another one with consent of the clerk, so I'll just move back to the Sixth Amendment, replacing lines 7 and 8 on page 31, to change it from the minister must not allow the product to be used if it is unsafe. And without this amendment, again, public confidence will be undermined and regulatory decisions will have no effect. I think one of the ones that if I were picking one, and I can't really do that, that's not, they come as a package, but if someone felt on the liberal benches that what was the one thing that might make this less appalling, it would be this one, partie vers 7, parce que le projet de loi C-30 à l'article.
That Bill C-30 in Clause 57 be amended by replacing lines 32 to 38 on page 32 with the following. Then 1 year after the day on which the order comes into force and is not to be extended. If the minister has concluded that the environmental risks are unacceptable, and if the pesticides are of an insufficient value to protect large-scale or regional economic considerations, and finally, if reasonable alternatives are available.
I'm not going to speak to whether I have more amendments, but just to please plead with my friends across the way. In the 51 years I've worked on pesticides in this country, this is the single most regressive proposal I've ever seen. Stephen Harper's government never touched toxic chemicals. It did, I will say that the Harper administration did massive damage to environmental impact assessment law and Fisheries Act, but those were repaired subsequently. But nobody's ever in any government of any political stripe, in my experience, ever proposed anything as appalling as this. So I beg my colleagues around the table. I know that I've had the great generosity of time. I'm deeply, deeply grateful. But again, trade implications, our products could be rejected again, over and over again. So even looking just at the economics of this, whoever drafted this didn't look at the facts. They didn't look at the economics. They certainly didn't look at the environmental risks, and they didn't consider that pesticides, the Canadian Cancer Society has been clear for years that pesticides carry risks depending on the pesticide. And what kind of economic argument is used? I recall this one because I was in the Mulroney government as an advisor, and I'd been the lawyer for Friends of the Earth in the Alachlor case. The moment that Monsanto's economic argument for why their carcinogenic herbicide Alachlor must not be banned, and the agriculture minister at the time was prepared to accept this argument, it would be unfair to ban Alachlor, Monsanto, and Agriculture Canada said, because its next closest competitor also caused cancer. It took Jacob, as former Minister of Health, to say, I'm sorry, I'd have to stand up in the House of Commons after the Minister of Agriculture licenses this product, and if asked, I will say this product, this herbicide Alachlor, causes cancer. The economic arguments at the time were seen to override Jacob's argument. Fortunately, Cabinet didn't buy it, but I don't see any criteria in C-30 that would prevent a carcinogenic, known carcinogen to continue to be used in dangerous and certainly risky circumstances with no economic case having to be made. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, my colleagues. Again, I'm pleading with you, particularly the Liberal members in this place, Conservative members. I know the Bloc Québécois is supporting my position, and I'm deeply grateful. As if we had NDP members at the table, but of course, they're not recognized party, and I'm grateful that me as a representative of an unrecognized party was given this latitude. Thank you again, Madam